Cool. Yeah, I might just start with the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you are new to who Stat Central is, we're basically a consulting service. We consult to the entire university. So if you're a HDR student, we can provide you with help with your study planning and statistical analyses. And if you're from one of our partner schools, you're also eligible for help. If you don't know, just don't worry about that. But if you would like help from us, on our website, there's a place where you can request a consultation, and that's how to get in touch with us. So now today's seminar, we run these seminars every month, is by Nixon Ning. Nixon joined us from ANU at the beginning of the year, and he's going to tell us about variable selection. So thanks, Nixon.
Yeah, thank you, Eve. Okay. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about variable selection. So if you're attending this talk, I guess maybe perhaps in your mind you have some kind of idea of some kind of data that you have where perhaps you're thinking you might want to do variable selection. But for the purposes of this talk, I'd like you to indulge me in a silly little example, hypothetical example that I have just for this talk instead. So, but definitely keep your data also in the back of your own mind. So, yeah, you're a farmer. You grow bananas. That's excellent, great, fabulous. However, you recently realized your bananas are actually radioactive, and that is not so good. And so perhaps you, in this case, you might think, well, I'm going to collect some data. Okay, I don't know if you would actually think this as a farmer, but let's say you thought this. I'm going to collect some data and look at some variables that perhaps I think might affect the radioactivity of my bananas, and yeah, hopefully gain some insight from which variables you can control to reduce the radioactivity of your bananas. So what would that kind of process, or what would that look like from a statistical modeling perspective? Well, it might look something like this. So you hopefully you're somewhat familiar with this kind of notation. So you might measure your radioactivity of your bananas in becquerels, call that Y. And then you might have a bunch of variables or covariates, independent variables, x1 up to xp. So that might be soil pH, rainfall, temperature, etc. And suppose, so again, for this talk, I'm going to be kind of talking about it, variable selection mostly in terms, in the context of a linear model, but the ideas are definitely not limited to just a linear regression model. So I guess the crux of the matter is you kind of don't know which of these x's are actually affecting your y. So you don't know which of these variables is actually affecting your radioactivity. Some might be affecting it, some might not be affecting it at all. So in terms of the statistical model, you're kind of saying, well, you're kind of thinking that some of these slopes, beta, might be zero, I think. So that kind of leads us into the first question I want to address in this talk, and that is, what is variable selection? So variable selection is basically asking the question, which, if any, of the slopes beta are zero. So it could be none of them, it could be all of them. Or in other words, you're asking the question, which covariates X should I include in the model? So right off the bat, I want to, I guess, emphasize that this is conceptually distinct from just wanting to test, let's say, your slope for every single one of your covariates. So testing P hypotheses of whether or not they're equal to zero. So they're distinct in the sense that, so when you are kind of not sure which X's you should include in your model, that's kind of variable selection. But when you a priori, if you say, suppose you do a bunch of treatments, a bunch of different treatments to see if they have some effect on some disease, and you a priori want to test if each of those treatments, or you suspect they probably affect the disease, and you want to test if they actually do from your data, then that's hypothesis testing. So it's it can be subtle sometimes, but that's kind of a conceptual difference there. I do see confusion between those things sometimes. So I talked about what is variable selection. Now I want to kind of talk about why you want to do variable selection. So just because you have kind of a lot of covariates, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do variable selection. But there are good reasons to do so. So apart from the fact that maybe your core research question is to basically do variable selection. So you want to see, you have a bunch of covariates, you want to see which of the slopes are zero, basically. I've also listed 6 reasons there of why you might want to do variable selection. So I have a bit more information on the slides than I really want to go into, in case you want to kind of look back. So the slides will be uploaded later, and if you want to look back, there's some information there that I might just kind of skim through in the talk. So there's prediction. So variable selection techniques, they can improve your prediction. They can help deal with multicollinearity. They help with your interpretability, parsimony, practical considerations, and identifiability. So from what I've seen, mostly in my short career so far, people are often interested, I guess, predominantly in these first 2, although that certainly might not be the case for you. So when some of your slopes beta are actually 0, the variable selection techniques can improve the prediction of your model as well as deal with multicollinearity. Okay, so that's kind of why you might want to do variable selection. Okay, so now I want to kind of go into how to actually do variable selection. So before I go into how to do variable selection, I kind of want to talk about how not to do variable selection. And this is things I have kind of seen throughout my time. So consider this kind of, I would call, I guess, a naive approach. So you could fit just the full model with all of your covariates with, let's say, least squares as usual. And then you can answer your research question of which of these variables are important by just choosing the covariates with a p-value less than 0.05, magical number. Well, then a problem with that, so you can do that, but it turns out you can actually kind of do better than that. So if you do that, then the covariates with the slopes that are actually equal to 0 is actually still going to be chosen 5% of the time. That's kind of the definition of a p-value. And even if you kind of try to adjust for multiple comparisons or things like that, you're still going to have some non-zero probability of selecting covariates that aren't actually important. And also, if you kind of take this approach, then you won't actually get any of the prediction and multicollinearity benefits because your interpretation and inference still has to be done under the full model, since all you've done is just kind of look at the results and choose the covariates with p-value less than 0.05 as important for your research question. So, okay. So that kind of begs the question, well, what if you fit the model again using only the chosen covariates? Well, then in this case, your inference is actually going to be correct, and this is incorrect. And this is a very important point. So anything that you kind of do to the data, it kind of affects the variability, or basically it affects the inference of your estimates. So basically, if you just fit the model again and look at the regression output for the reduced model naively, then that inference is very likely going to be incorrect because the uncertainty from choosing the covariates isn't going to be incorporated there. So there are a bunch of, so I've listed like a few points there of just further philosophical problems of what happens if you just if you just look at the p-values and just take out the ones that's not less than 0.05 and then keep fitting new models to that. So I don't really want to go into that too much in this talk, but they're here. So, but what I do want to emphasize is that forward and stepwise selection suffers from similar problems and also inflated type 1 errors. So that's not techniques I would really recommend. So backward selection is kind of the lesser of the evils of, so you might have heard in some of your courses or whatever, you might have heard of forward, stepwise, backward selection. And those methods are methodical, but they do suffer from this. Your inference, for example, is pretty likely going to be incorrect. But in terms of this variation, so for example, I think in old versions of SPSS, you only have kind of those choices. Then backward selection is kind of the lesser evil of these. Okay, so this slide was not how not to do variable selection. And now I want to kind of start talking about how to do variable selection. So before I start talking about how to do variable selection, I want to talk about a desirable property. So this is really kind of how statisticians like to think about the variable selection problem. So something we want our variable selection technique or method to have is this thing called selection consistency, which is basically saying if you have enough data, then you want to choose the important covariates and only the important covariates with a probability basically equal to 1. So all the previous methods I've talked about, they do not have selection consistency. But it is possible, and I'll talk about that later. So, or rather right now. So I want to consider now a selection method that can actually achieve selection consistency, and it's called full subset selection. So you might have kind of heard of this as well floating around, and that's basically you want to consider all the possible combinations of your covariates, and then you would compare them, all of the models, using some kind of measure. And I'll talk about the measures a bit later. But in our banana example, let's say we decided a priori that we actually only care about X1 and X2, so soil, pH, and rainfall. And we just kind of ignore the others. And then to do full subset selection, using just these two covariates, you would consider 3 different models. You would consider the model with only X1, you would consider the model with only X2, and you would consider a model with both X1 and X2. And then you would compare all 3 of those models using some kind of measure. So there's many measures proposed in the literature. I've listed some of those there. So here I just want to kind of emphasize or make a note that R² is not a measure you can use to do model selection in this way, because it will kind of always just end up choosing the largest full model. Okay, so next I want to kind of go into the choice of measure a bit. And in particular, I want to focus on 2 probably the most commonly used methods, at least from my point of view. And they're very highly debated as to which one's better. So I just want to talk about Ankaike's information criterion, AIC, and the Schwartz Bayesian information criterion, BIC. So these, they're kind of defined in this way, which is just, so this part here you can think of as just like the R². And then basically they also penalize the number of covariates that you have in your selected model. So why do I kind of want to talk about this? So this is, I guess, a little bit of a tangent from like methods per se of doing variable selection, but it's still an important part of most methods that do variable selection. So the choice of measure is actually important, and I want to emphasize that. So If you do full subset selection and you use BIC, then it's actually then this whole procedure, this full subset selection with BIC procedure is shown to be selection consistent. And meanwhile, if you do this full subset selection with AIC, then it's actually shown to be optimal for prediction. Yeah, those are actually kind of mutually exclusive things, it turns out. And so there's a lot of debate about which one is better. So if you're interested in prediction predominantly, then usually AIC is the better choice. But if you really want to know which variables exactly are important, then kind of as a default, I would recommend BIC. So AIC tends to choose more variables than BIC. Well, it always chooses more variables than BIC, more or equal to anyway. And but it can sometimes choose variables that aren't actually important, even when you have a very large sample size. So I want to kind of go into that a little bit, since there's often a bit of confusion as to why, like if your BIC is choosing this true correct model, why is it not also optimal for prediction? So I did a really simple little simulation here. So I suppose I generated from this model y is equal to 0.1 times x1 plus 0 times x2 plus an error term, which is just standard normal. If I generate 1,000 observations and do this 1,000 times, I can see which models were selected under AIC and BIC. And the results kind of look like this. So I kind of want you to just focus on this last bullet point here. It's really just the most important one. So if you do that simulation, you'll find something like this. So if you use AIC to do the model selection, then I'll actually end up selecting x1 977 times and x2 194 times. And if you use BIC, then I will include x1 967 times and x2 42 times. So you can see that so x2 is the one that's not important, and x1 is the one that is actually important with the slope of 0.1. And if you're using AIC, then it's including x2, which is the non-important one, a lot more than if you're using BIC. However, it is also including the important variable x1 more times than BIC is including that important variable x1. And so that kind of explains a little bit why the BIC can be selection consistent while AIC is not, but also AIC having being better for prediction. So because when you include x2 in your model, it's not actually affecting your prediction that much because you're just going to get an estimate close to 0. But when you don't include x1 in your model, that screws up your prediction a lot. So you definitely, so because AIC is including x1 more than BIC, then that's how it's kind of better on average in terms of prediction. And if I increase the sample size, how do I hide this top? Okay, so yeah, if I increase the sample size, so this one was 1,000. Now, if I increase the sample size to 2,000, you can see that it's still a similar story. So as I increase the sample size further, BIC is including x2 like barely any of the times, while AIC is still including x2 162 times. And no matter how much you increase your sample size, AIC is going to keep including x2 something around 15 or 16% of the time. And here still, AIC has included x1 one more time than BIC. So it's still kind of doing better overall in the prediction in that sense. Okay, so there's a problem with this whole full subset selection approach, and that is it's a pretty big problem. So if you have a lot of covariates, then actually you have to fit 2 to the power of p models, and this becomes computationally infeasible as you have a lot of covariates. So yeah, you won't be able to run it probably with maybe like anything more than like 30 is my guess, although I haven't really tried. But it is a problem with this whole full subset selection approach. Although if you don't have that many covariates, this full subset selection with BIC or EIC approach is something I can recommend if it's feasible for your data. Okay, but let's talk about what happens when you do have quite a lot of covariates. So I want to talk about this technique called the lasso, least absolute shrinkage and selection operator. So this was a paper written by a guy called Tibshirani in the year I was born. It's a very famous paper. It's about 60,000 citations. So long story short, so if you, I have some math here, but it's not really important that you understand it or anything. So this first line here is just the definition of the usual least squares estimator. And Tibshirani, one day he was like, let's add a penalty here to this least squares objective function. And if you add this penalty here, then it turns out that the corresponding lasso estimator, which I call beta hat lasso, will actually select some of those estimates will be exactly 0. And that's exactly what you want. That's variable selection, right? And not only can it do variable selection, it can actually do so in a very computationally feasible manner. So I have this sentence here, but it basically says you can do it just as fast as doing a single regression fit. And that's very fast compared to doing 2 to the power p regression fits. Okay, so this slide kind of just summarizes what I just said in the last slide. But there's a problem, however. So when this was invented, people were very happy because we now had an approach to do variable selection, even when you have a very large number of covariates. However, it turns out that the lasso is actually not going to be selection consistent when covariates are too correlated. And that's a kind of, from a statistician's point of view, that's kind of a very big problem because we definitely want our variable selection procedure to be selection consistent. So I guess one thing I forgot to mention in this last slide was there's actually this penalty term lambda here, which is kind of controlling how much you should penalize the size of your coefficient estimates. And that lambda needs to be chosen by some kind of measure or information criteria like AIC or BIC that I was talking about before. So, okay, so it turns out this lasso is actually not selection consistent. So what do we do instead? Well, there is this procedure in 2016 called the adaptive lasso, which kind of relaxes that representable condition a lot. So even if you have covariates that are pretty correlated, the adaptive lasso still deals with that pretty well. And the adaptive lasso, basically the definition is like that. So basically, compared to the lasso, it just has some weights as well for each of your slope coefficients, which is, for example, the 1 over your least squares coefficient estimates. So just the preface here, I think this adaptive lasso selection procedure using something like BIC is probably my personal default choice, my blanket choice, given no other context. I'll probably recommend the adaptive lasso with penalty term chosen with BIC as a selection procedure. And I'll kind of go a little bit into why. So the adaptive lasso is selection consistent if you use BIC to choose the penalty lambda. And furthermore, it has this other property that is quite good called the oracle property. So it's basically saying, like, if you have enough sample size, if your sample size is large enough, then your estimators are just as good as if you knew a priori which of the betas were actually 0, and then you just fitted the reduced true model with something like least squares. So what this kind of implies for you in practice is that you're allowed to use the adaptive lasso to do your selection, and then you can actually refit your model again using something like least squares, using just the covariates selected by the lasso. And in that case, your inference, like your confidence intervals, for example, and everything, they'll still be correct. So I'm talking about the adaptive lasso a lot. So I want to kind of show you a very simple example of how to actually apply that in practice. So so this example is in R, but you can kind of fit. So if you have a package that can fit the lasso, then you can actually always fit the adaptive lasso, provided you also have the weights available, by just scaling the covariates. But here I have my example in R, where it's kind of fairly simple to do, even though there's not really, the package here is GLMnet, which isn't dedicated doing adaptive lasso, but you can do the adaptive lasso here, and I'll show you how. So in this simple example here, I just generated I simulated some data using just that linear model. And I basically have 3 covariates here. And one of the slopes are 1, one of the slopes are 0.1, and one of the slopes are 0. So the third covariate is not important. And so I'd want my procedure to be able to kind of suss that out. Okay, so in this slide, I just generated some data. And to apply the adaptive lasso, you can do the following. So first, you want to get the adaptive lasso weights, and you can do that in this case by doing just the least squares fit of your responses to your covariates, and then taking the absolute value of 1 over the slope coefficients from that least squares fit. And then you can fit the adaptive lasso using this GLMnet function in the GLMnet package. So this is just the code for that. So this penalty factor here is what's kind of doing, telling it to do the adaptive lasso as opposed to just the lasso. And you want to make sure you have the standardized is equal to false here. Otherwise that kind of screws up everything by scaling your covariates beforehand. So this line 6 here actually fits the adaptive lasso for a range of lambda values. And so you should, what you need to do next is you can look at, so in this example, I'm looking at BIC. I've chosen BIC as my model selection measure or information criteria. And so the package kind of doesn't give you BIC as a default. It kind of actually does cross-validation as a default, which is actually asymptotically equivalent to AIC. But anyway, so the cross-validation is also okay. But in this example, I'm looking at BIC, and I actually have to calculate that myself. But it's pretty easy. It's just one line. It's line 7 here. And then, so you can look at you can choose the best amount of penalty. You can choose the best lambda by finding the lambda that minimizes the BIC, and then finally fitting the adaptive lasso using that chosen value of lambda. So if I do that, then I can look at my point estimates that's given to me from the adaptive lasso. And if you just recall, the true values, the true slopes were 1, 0.1, and 0. So in this case, my adaptive lasso has correctly chosen that my first and second covariates are actually important, and the third one is not. However, you can see that this point estimate for the second covariate slope is actually 0.078, which is kind of a little bit smaller than we'd like, ideally, especially since I have like 2,000 data points. And And that's actually because the adaptive lasso does have some finite sample bias, but also because sometimes the algorithm in R kind of doesn't end up getting your actual optimum value of lambda. It often stops like a little bit before that. So you can kind of check that by looking at the BIC plot. So if I just look at the BIC values, this is basically, the index is basically, the larger it is, the smaller my lambda is. And in this case, it's kind of just decreasing like that monotonically. And so if I looked at that, I guess I wouldn't be too confident that the optimum value of lambda was actually chosen. So what you could do, you don't have to do this, but you could. So usually the algorithm, even if it looks like that, it's still kind of okay. But if you want to be more sure, then you can kind of just set the lambda values yourself manually. So you can check which lambda values were used in the previous fit, and then in a second fit here, you can choose the lambda values yourself. So in this case, I'm telling the code to check the lambda values from 0.1 down to 0.001 in increments of negative 0.001. That's just how it turned out for my data. And if I do that, then I'll actually find my value of lambda that is optimal is actually a bit smaller than what was chosen in the previous slides. So if I did that, then my point estimate actually, so for the second covariate in particular, goes up to 0.0845. So previously it was like 0.078. So doing this has kind of improved the bias of my estimate here. And now if I look at the BIC plot, you can actually see that I have this jump over here. So the reason so you kind of want your plot to look like that, because what this means is that as your lambda is decreasing, so your penalty is getting less and less, then at this point, suddenly, so at this point here, I still am excluding the third covariate X3. But here it suddenly jumps because at this point, it's now also including the third covariate X3 in the model. And so if you get a plot that looks like that, then you can be a bit more confident that this chosen lambda value, which would be this one right here, where my mouse is, this point here, you can be a bit more confident that that's kind of the optimal one. Okay, now that said, so this is like a plot called the regularization path that the package gives you as a default, which is just telling you. So this one's not too informative, but the previous one, for example, this is telling you just like at different lambda values, what are the point estimates of your coefficients, and that's sometimes useful to look at. So for example, you can see that this black line is basically the point estimate for x1, and it's kind of non-zero, like even just from the beginning, right? Whereas the red line for x2, which had a slope of 0.1, it's only non-zero after I relax lambda a lot. And so in that kind of sense, this plot tells you a little bit about, you can view it as kind of a relative variable importance of your variables. So x1, my x1 had a slope of 1. And so that's quite a bit more important than my x2, which had a slope of 0.1. And this slope is kind of reflecting that. Oh, sorry, this plot is kind of reflecting that. Okay, so this was setting lambda manually, but actually, if you recall from what I said previously, you can actually, the adaptive lasso has this thing called the oracle property, which means that if your sample size is large enough, which you should be relatively, I guess, at least somewhat confident that you have a decent sample size before applying the adaptive lasso, because all its good properties that I talked about is actually just asymptotic results for very large sample sizes. But anyway, if you have enough confidence that you have decent sample size, you can refit the model with, in this case, just the LM function, so just the usual least squares model. Then you can get these estimates from that, and you can see that the point estimate in particular for x2 was improved even further from the previous fit, because this the adaptive lasso kind of has this finite sample bias, but you can deal with that by just fitting the least squares model again, but without x3, which is what my adaptive lasso has taught me. Okay, so all this to kind of say my default recommendation would probably be the adaptive lasso with lambda chosen using BIC, and weights chosen using least squares or maximum likelihood, and then refitting it again, refitting the model again using just the selected covariates with something like least squares or maximum likelihood. Okay, so however, so I've had a lot of howevers in this talk, but I promise this is the final one. In fact, I'm getting to my final slide. So I've talked about the adaptive lasso a lot, and again, it's my default recommendation. However, that doesn't mean it's omnipotent. So there are a few drawbacks with it. So the adaptive lasso needs the weights, right? Like you need to be able to get the weights somehow, and in particular, those weights kind of need to be consistent estimators of the true slope values. So if you're in a case where you don't really know how to get those weights, then you won't be able to apply the adaptive lasso. So for example, if you have a larger number of covariates than your sample size, then your least squares estimate isn't going to work. And so in that case, you might not be able to get the weights for your adaptive lasso, and then everything breaks down. That's kind of the first and foremost, most important drawback, I would say, of the adaptive lasso. There's also a few others. So if you have more covariates than your number of observations, then you're going to select at most n covariates to include in your model. That's kind of a limitation, but it might not be too much of a problem for your data. So there are some alternatives, like this smoothly clipped absolute deviation, the SCAD and the MCP variable selection techniques, which is kind of, I feel like, a bit more contrived than the adaptive lasso. It's a lot less intuitive, but a lot harder to explain. But they do kind of tend to have smaller finite sample bias than the adaptive lasso. So I can, if you're feeling a bit adventurous, I can recommend the SCAD and the MCP as well. And then, so in this talk, I've kind of focused on just single variable selection. So like looking at each variable as if they're kind of like independent, let's say. But there are also other things that you can do. So in some problems, you might want to group certain covariates together and then kind of include or exclude them kind of at the same time. You don't want them to be, you don't want one to be included, but the other not. Then you can do something like the group lasso. And there's also other techniques like diffuse lasso and stuff that I've listed here that kind of deals with different problems. So if you have a slightly different problem than just I want to see which variables are important. So for example, like that grouping that I was talking about before, then you might want to look into some of these things, which allows you to do that. And then finally, all those good properties I talked about the adaptive lasso does rely on having a decent sample size. So if you have a pretty small sample size, you probably want to do some bootstrapping, for example, to see how sensitive your selection procedure is acting. So if, for example, each time you bootstrap, you get a different set of important variables, then that's probably not a very good sign. Yeah, that's kind of, you're kind of in trouble. And you can ask me about that later if you're curious. But Yeah, because if the asymptotics has been reached, then your important variables should not really be changing at all, no matter how much you bootstrap it. Okay, so that's, I think, mostly what I wanted to talk about today. Okay, yep, thank you.
What's the question? Yeah. No. Oh, I was just gonna. Oh, so the question, yeah.
Yeah, so the questions, would screening out highly correlated variables first and proceeding with lesser, so not adaptive lesser, be a reasonable approach when the motivation is a prediction. So if your motivation is just prediction, then the lesser can be a decent choice. And you probably want to use AIC with that or something like that, or maybe corrected AIC with that, which optimizes the prediction. So my answer to that so prediction is kind of a pretty complex problem. If your test error is getting decreased by that, then I'd probably say it's okay. But I think in the case of prediction, it's perhaps not really necessary to actually do that first step of screening out the highly correlated variables, because if your interest is just in prediction, then you don't really care about the whole variable selection and selection consistency. Then the lesser is probably going to do okay. Yeah, even if your variables are correlated. So the correlated variables, the thing that interferes with the most is that selection consistency thing. Yes.
Thank you. One of your slides said that do not use R squared.
Yeah.
Well, I did use AIC and BIC to in model selection. I have 4 models that I compare, but I mean, based on the AIC and BIC, one model is the best, but have a low R squared, and the second best, I mean, based on the AIC and BIC, it has lot better R squared. So I said that based on the AIC and the AC and also R squared, so the best model is this. Is it wrong if I said it? Because I still use the R squared.
Right. Well, so does one of your models have a lot more variables than the other one?
Yeah, pretty much.
Right. Yeah. So
yeah, the other one is only like 3 variables, and the other one is like first order and second order and third order. And then well, probably they are not comparable. I don't know.
right. So yeah. So the question is I was kind of doing model selection, and I was looking at AIC and BIC, and it's the AIC basically was basically telling me that I should be selecting the smaller model. However, my smaller model actually had a lot smaller R squared compared to the bigger model. And so I guess the question is, can I just select the bigger model since it has a bigger R squared, right? So in this slide I said, you shouldn't use R squared to do your model selection. Yeah. So actually between models of the same kind of number of covariates, you can use R squared, but from the thing you're describing, which is you have your R squared is a lot bigger for the much larger model. That's kind of expected, and that's exactly the kind of thing that AIC and BIC tries to control for. So when you have a lot of covariates, and when you keep adding more, then your R squared is always going to get bigger a lot. I mean, it could be, yeah. My recommendation is probably still to trust the AIC, BIC, unfortunately, and yeah, you just have to accept that. Yeah, so it's not too good there.
Yeah, it overfits the noise and the data. The noise and noise. So, yeah. Anyway, I have a couple of questions. Thanks for talk. You mentioned that I was just curious about cross-validation and prediction error versus BIC. I think you said that I didn't know that it was particularly equivalent to AIC. Is that right?
Yeah, it's as so the question was, Nick didn't know that okay, it's not a question, but Nick was surprised to find out that cross-validation is equivalent to using AIC. And yes, so AIC is equivalent to leave one out, cross-validation asymptotically.
Okay, right. So just following on from given that this has this great oracle property for the adaptive lasso, I mean, does that depend on how you find your hyperparameter, your lambda? Like, I mean, when they were doing these studies finding that it had the oracle property, was that irrespective of how lambda was chosen? Like, you chose lambda through AIC or cross-validated prediction error versus BIC, because that's going to change the lambda, and then theoretically that's going to change the covariance of subway.
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So the question was, does the basically is the selection of lambda, is the way I select lambda in the adaptive lasso, which, for example, using AIC or BIC, is the way I use select the lambda important, in particular for the oracle property? And the answer is yes. So when you use BIC, you get the oracle property. So I guess in this paper by Zhou, 2016, the oracle property holds when your lambda is kind of satisfies is like between two different growth rates. And it turns out that if you use BIC to choose lambda, then it satisfies that condition. And so you get the oracle property. If you use AIC, you will not satisfy that condition. You don't.
Same with cross-validated prediction.
Yes.
You have to use okay, cool, that's really good. Okay, cool. And just sorry, I've got one other question. Like one thing I found, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but like when you're doing logistic regression or survival, the number of events is important, as well as the total sample. So has anybody come up with a way to constrain or like optimize with this sort of other problem of number of events? Because especially with AIC, massively overfitting to the number of events. I might have an event to variable ratio of like 3 or something like that, or whatever, instead of 20. And even BIC models, sometimes I find they're overfitting to the number of events. I'm not sure that's something of it.
Yeah, sorry, good question, but I'm not actually too sure about that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yes.
Do you have any opinions on using like the lambda that utilizes BIC versus with BIC as a equivalent to the lambda plus standard error?
Yeah, well, okay, so a question from Eve is, do I have any opinion on choosing lambda using BIC versus choosing lambda using the was it BIC plus one standard error?
Yeah, like so it minimizes the BIC that makes the lambda that makes the BIC within one standard error. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's so in I think in GLMNet there's that option to choose that lambda to minimize the within one standard error thing. Yeah, I've looked into that a little bit, but it seems a bit weird. Yeah.
So I mean, I think generally the idea is that it gives you a more parsimonious model. So it gives you the most parsimonious model that is still consistent with the minimal lambda you obtain from cross-validation concept. Is the reasoning, I think.
Right.
And that can be desirable for prediction models, I guess.
Right. Okay.
And you can do it easily if you do cross-validation, because then you have all your cross-validation to get the standard error, right? I don't know that how you would do it with BIC.
Yeah, so like from what I know, like from all these like all this statistics and oracle property stuff, they don't really talk about that lambda plus 1AC way of choosing lambda. So maybe it's still a kind of avenue of further research. Yeah. But it sounds like it wouldn't be selection consistent. Sorry, that's just my guess. Don't quote me.